Kalam podcast is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now, and please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam Podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. Go to patreon.com and search for Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the third installment of Kalam Digest. We're recording on Tuesday, the 27th of August. My name is Edgar Mannheimer. Welcome to the show, Sam Samra.
Thank you, Edgar.
I don't like to say that I'm right a lot, especially not when it comes to there not being a ceasefire deal. But we were speaking last week that I didn't think Blinken was up to the task of creating a ceasefire agreement, and maybe it's not Blinken's fault, let's say, but it certainly didn't happen. Hamas has reiterated that it was fine with the deal that was put on the table back in May and July. Israel essentially has moved the goalpost several times since then, putting in new conditions on this agreement. And some Egyptian security sources seem to confirm this. But with Biden saying that it's urgent and this is the last time we can ever get a deal, what is your take on this? How bad is it?
Well, the basic thing, of course, is that we haven't had a deal for half a year, so it's nothing new. We keep on having these discussions every week, it seems now, where all involved parties say it's urgent to have a ceasefire deal. Even the Israelis seem to say that publicly, though, of course, behind the scenes, they don't seem to be very urgent at all. So there's nothing new, basically. But, of course, for the Palestinians on the ground, it's a catastrophe. Another week of war is another week of people being killed and children contracting polio, for example. We have an upswing of contagious diseases, and just during this weekend, 170 Palestinians were killed in Israeli strikes. So in that sense, of course, it's urgent. Every day without a ceasefire is another day of this ongoing genocide. But in terms of the discussions between the parties, it seems, like you said, like the Israelis keep moving the goalposts. It's not clear if that is because they don't want a ceasefire deal at all, or if it's about internal disagreements within the ruling coalition in Israel about what they could accept, for example. The main sticking points, as we've already discussed on previous episodes, seems to be that the Israelis are, firstly, they're not actually offering any permanent disengagement from Gaza, which of course is if that's not in the cards, then Hamas can accept this. It was obviously part of the last stage of the three-stage deal that was proposed in July, which Hamas still accepts. The other part is that the Israelis demand both control over the Rafah border crossing on the Palestinian side, and they demand to stay in control, as it seems indefinitely, of this corridor cutting the Gaza Strip in half between Gaza City and the south.
So essentially nothing really has happened, although people have been talking in between four walls, so to speak. But if we look at, there was an escalation. We've been kind of, ever since we started these news digests, we've been kind of predicting some kind of confrontation, let's say, between the so-called axis of resistance and the state of Israel, following the assassinations in Lebanon and in Tehran. And we saw some kind of some iteration of that yesterday morning. What happened?
Yeah, well, what happened was, it started out with the Israelis bombing southern Lebanon, what they called a preemptive strike, attacking Hezbollah positions, claiming to destroyed thousands of missile positions of Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah retaliating by sending, I think, a couple hundred of rockets into Israel. So firstly, it's kind of difficult to know what the effect were of these Hezbollah rockets. They've been claiming that it was a success, and Houthis and other allies have congratulated them on this. The Israelis, as per usual, say that most of the rockets just fell on farmland and no one was hurt. This is also what they always say. They admitted to one naval officer being killed when a boat was struck by an Hezbollah rocket. It's very difficult, as I said, always to know what the casualties are on the Israeli side, because they have no interest basically in letting on anything more than what is strictly necessary. What we know is that they released a gag order for the Israeli press and media, saying that it was absolutely forbidden to report anything on casualties from these strikes, which of course would perhaps point to there being some substantial damage done. But what is important, I think, on the biggest strategic point here is that it was once again not an all-out offensive, not an all-out attack, but limited in scope. And Iran has explicitly stated that this was not the promised retaliation for the murder of Haniyeh in Tehran. Further escalation is still in the cards, but obviously, if Hezbollah, Iran want to de-escalate, this would obviously be a way of not losing too much face and just letting it be at this. But we don't know basically what's going to happen. As long as ceasefire discussions are ongoing, we still also don't know what Hamas are telling Iran and Hezbollah. Maybe they tell them to hold back. Maybe they've given up already. We don't know that.
Yeah, because obviously when you wake up to news of escalatory strikes between Israel and Hezbollah, obviously your system kind of jolts a little bit and like, okay, is this it? You know, or is this the beginning of a regional war? Clearly, this was still within the rules of engagement, as they say.
Yep.
But at the same time, aren't the negotiations over? I mean, we see kind of them fall apart, or like in what sense are they still ongoing?
Well, in the sense that at least the Americans claim that they are ongoing, but you might be right that is the only sense in which they haven't fallen apart. Hamas basically just keeps repeating that they are fine with the deal from July, but they will not accept the new Israeli additions. And the Israelis don't say anything publicly besides just randomly saying that Hamas refuses to negotiate. So yeah, it seems maybe you're right. Maybe we actually have to just declare this round of negotiations to be over. Another important thing I think we forgot to mention is that Egypt seems to be worried themselves about these negotiations because it's part of their the deal from 1979, the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, that Israel should not post their army on the border crossing with Egypt. Yeah. There's a very specific and complicated rules set up for how much Israeli forces can be amassed at the border. And they're claiming with some, I think that they are right in this, that Israel taking control over the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing would break this agreement. And this is also obviously something that is important for Sisi because, as we all know, the Egyptian people are strongly anti-Zionist, strongly pro-Palestinian, while Sisi is funded by the US and totally dependent on keeping the peace with Israel at all costs. So it's a very complicated balancing process that's ongoing for the Egyptian government.
Yeah, I sense that giving the border crossing to Israel or handing over control, I mean, in a sense, they do control it because Egypt still has to consult with Israel. But I mean, the superficial aspect of letting Israel control the border with its military, with boots on the ground, seems like a concession Sisi is unwilling to make, or at least that's let's say an orange line, because I'm tired of red lines because they're always broken.
Okay. As we all know, I mean, Sisi himself will probably be totally fine with it, but he knows that this is a very, very sensitive topic for him. It's probably the question of all that the Egyptian government is least popular on, and everyone in Egypt knows this.
Yeah.
So they have to tread very carefully.
Yeah, and of course, there is the fear, which happens from time to time, that rogue Egyptian soldiers will open fire on Israelis. This has happened in just the past few months, where they actually managed to kill an Israeli soldier, or maybe it was more than one. And and I mean, this is obviously a huge scare for the regime. If just a small, insignificant portion of the Egyptian army decides to open fire on the Israelis, that could escalate very, very quickly.
They very much prefer to have a buffer zone between themselves and the Israelis.
Yeah, in the form of the people of Gaza.
Yeah, exactly.
Awful. Let's move on to a third story. Israeli settlers storm Aqsa Mosque yet again, obviously protected and at this point, shouldn't we even say endorsed by the Israeli occupation forces. The Minister for Security, Ben-Gvir, says he will build the temple on Al-Aqsa. That's the third temple, and I guess, they're working on all these kind of Dr. Frankenstein tests to produce the red heifer on ranches in Texas. Very professional organization, this whole thing. But anyway, it seems...
Let's not delve too deeply into the...
let's not fall down that red heifer rabbit hole. But anyway, this is just the latest iteration of this kind of terrorist stuff where settlers go and harass Palestinians at Al-Aqsa and threaten to really what it is, I mean, demolish the third holiest place in Islam and the kind of like last vestiges of Palestinian pride and freedom on the occupied West Bank. So tell us about what's going on here.
I mean, as you say, it's nothing new. The settler movement in Israel and the far-right movement has for a long time had as its goal to rebuild the temple, as it's called, which will be, as you said, the third temple after the first Temple of Solomon, the second temple of Herod, and then you have then will be the third temple of Ben-Gvir, then I suppose.
Oh my God. Let me just say, I hope that Ben-Gvir ends up with the same fate as old Herod.
Let's not get political here. The mainstream position in Israeli politics has been for a long time that the site is holy to Jews, and therefore you shouldn't tread on it. And that's both theologically sound. I mean, that's been the position of Jewish orthodoxy since rabbinical times. But it's also, of course, a very convenient solution because it means that you could split the compound into the Wailing Wall below.
Let me just point out there that to create the piazza that is in front of the Wailing Wall, where foreigners and Israelis can access the area through the Wailing Wall, they demolished, and this is I think in 1967 when they occupied the old city. They demolished the old Bab el-Magharbe, which was the Moroccan district kind of the old city of Jerusalem. A market that was hundreds of years old, they just reduced to dust and built an open space.
Yeah, the Israeli idea of how to preserve the tradition and the holy sites is very, very peculiar, to say the least. Then Ben-Gvir and his associates start arguing that they should rebuild the temple. It's problematic for Palestinians, obviously, but it's also something that questions the status quo on the topic in Israeli politics.
Yeah,
and it pushes Netanyahu to the right because it's something that he probably thinks that most of his supporters would be fine with, but he still has to. He knows that this would be internationally politically unacceptable. This is actually something where he differs from let's say, the liberal part of the Zionist establishment, which would be totally against this. What's been ongoing around this question is a heightened tensions, basically, where they stormed the compound with the support of the army and the police, but it's been heating up over the last couple of days, and it's important both because of the very tense situation, of course, but also because the opposition, specifically Yair Lapid, one of the leading opposition politicians, have been calling out Netanyahu, saying that he has to fire Ben-Gvir if he doesn't stop escalating this situation, which, of course, Netanyahu knows that he can't, because then he would lose the basis of his support, which is the fundamentalist, settler, orthodox right wing.
Yeah.
So it kind of heightens the tensions between the opposition and the government in Israel. As we talked about before on this podcast, there is basically no disagreement on the war in Gaza. Both sides are in agreement that the war has been carried out. The war is reasonable and it has to be carried out. There's disagreement on to what extent a compromise could be reached or a ceasefire could be reached, perhaps. But there's no peace camp of any major size in Israel. But this is something where the opposition, the question of Ben-Gvir and the settler movement, is something where the opposition and Netanyahu actually differ.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've not met Ben-Gvir, thank God. I don't really want to, but I mean, as a journalist, you have to a lot of times meet crazy people. I have met, however, one of his, you called them associates, I don't know, his henchmen. A guy called Aryeh King, who is the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, or was at least at the time when I was there in 2022. And it's terrifyingly interesting to me, the way that they kind of like justify this thing, because so I'm like sitting in a cafe with him interviewing this guy, and he said, he's like, yeah, of course we're going to build a third temple. It's written, like, we have to do this.
It's in the book.
It's in the book, and he holds significant power, really, And he was actually he grew up on a kibbutz, what he called a right-wing kibbutz, which also just blew my mind. Anyway, so he said, because I asked just kind of simple critical questions. Well, why is it? How is it justified, like tearing down a mosque and Palestinians? Where are they going to go if you annex the West Bank? All these kind of things. And he said, look, The Muslims, they already have Mecca and they have Medina. And Jerusalem is only their third site. So us Jews, we only have Jerusalem. So it's only fair. And that just struck me as like the argument of a 5-year-old. But this is the people that we are dealing with. And these are the people that the U.S. is arming. I think it's important to remember that.
I mean, it's also interesting to me, at least, how just like you could argue that Salafis and the Islamist organizations were very inspired by Victorian morality, and they were trying to copy kind of the ethics of Victorian England, being very like anti-homosexual and repressive against women, etc. You may say that this particular kind of neo-Orthodox Judaism is much more similar to American evangelicals than it is to any traditional kind of Judaism.
Yes.
It's very much like, it's in the book. Of course, I mean, Orthodox Judaism is literalist in a certain sense, but it's also about interpretation. It's also about historical consciousness. It's a lot about, a wide-ranging free kind of debate. Yeah. This is more like Protestantist or radical Protestantist or even...
and even like aesthetically, the way that they speak, the way that they produce these extremely simple narratives, simplistic narratives, is so just American in general. It's just like, it's like you're sitting with, one of these Americans that just has these talking points and they just say them. But in the Israeli case, it's way more aggressive,
We should make a special episode on Ben-Gvir.
We should, actually. It'd be interesting to delve deep into his history. I mean, who his parents were and what their...
Kahanist and...
The Kahanists, yeah, for sure. And his background in Iraq, I'm fascinated by, like, where he's from and, Anyway, I think from the beginning of this war in Gaza, something that's, because I am a journalist, but something that's just blown my mind is how journalists across the world aren't up in arms way more than they are about the deadliest period for journalists since one started recording this kind of thing, I think in the late 80s or early 90s. So far, I think 115 journalists have been killed in Gaza, and the overwhelming majority are Palestinian. There's 1 or 2 Israelis and some Lebanese. But so now Reporters Without Borders has demanded that the EU suspend all treaties with Israel because of this what they call massacre of journalists. And I think that's quite a bold move. Reporters Without Borders are way more kind of, radical is the wrong word, but like outspoken, than many other sort of NGO organizations. But still, for them to demand that is quite heavy. Do you signal some kind of shift here?
I think absolutely. As you said, I mean, I think I also know that they are usually pretty outspoken, but this is high stakes. It's a high stakes demand. I mean, it's because they saying like you have to stop murdering journalists, and of course everyone would be in agreement with this in principle. No one would say like, well, that's fine. But saying that they should take actual political action, suspend trade agreements, etc., that is, that's something else. On the other hand, of course, it makes sense. It would be easy for the European Union, for example, to say this is an orange line, as you said. You have to do something about this, or we will in a month or something like that. They could use this to put pressure on them. But they could also do that all the time. That's one of the most obvious things that come out of this period since the 7th of October is not only is the EU and the US inefficient when it comes to pressuring Israel, they're actually not interested in even trying. We all know that they have these. I mean, the trade agreements with the EU are the second most important thing to Israel after American military funding, of course. They would have to change their ways, amend their ways, in a week if the EU said like we're stopping these agreements.
Of course,
which also, of course, includes, arms sales. It includes exchange of military security information, etc. But yeah, I mean, I think it's both very, very bold of them. It's a bold move, but I think it makes sense. I mean, it's something that everyone agrees on. When we talk about the genocide, etc., we all know that we have the facts are pretty clear, but it's easy for the EU to just say, oh, we don't really know yet. We know that more than 100 journalists have been killed by the Israelis, and we know that is something that is unacceptable to all.
Yeah, and we know that thousands of children have died. I mean, even if you don't consider it a genocide, I think the logical first step to confronting a state that simply will not stop killing children, no matter what their goal is, I think is to cut ties, at least, or to kind of like call up the ambassador, Clearly not happening. Okay, moving on to our last story, because we're running out of time. The situation in Gaza is obviously terrifyingly horrific. The latest is that disease is now spreading, and the first case of polio has been detected. So I don't know like enough about polio to. I mean, isn't that a kind of an extinct disease?
It's not extinct. But it's been extinct. Basically, it comes back when the health situation or the sanitary situation deteriorates below a certain level. This is what's happening here, but it's not just a horrible disease. It's also seen as kind of a sign that the health situation or the basic sanitary situation is extremely poor. So yeah, that's both in terms, of course, of the people who contract the disease. It's horrible, but it's also a horrible symbol of the situation for most of the population of Gaza, especially the children, of course.
Yeah.
Talking about this, I specifically this morning I got a news flash from, I think it's Al Jazeera, that due to Israeli bombings, the attempts to distribute vaccines have been stopped again. So we don't know. This might also, now we only know about one case. It's probably more cases that haven't been discovered yet, but it can pretty quickly go to an all-out like health catastrophe in itself and of itself. Trying to vaccinate a whole population during bombing campaign is in itself really difficult just under any circumstances. But of course, the situation also is that with the electricity grid basically destroyed and the healthcare system out of function, there is also the question of how to just keep the vaccines refrigerated, etc. So it's not that just it's dangerous to go there. It's also in many places really, really hard to even manage to carry out the vaccinations themselves. It's much more complicated than you might imagine. We would need to have a proper ceasefire in place for at least a week just to do this, and it's not happening, which is, I think, it's deeply upsetting.
Yeah, deplorable. I mean, it's also a matter of reaching people. When a majority of the population of Gaza is displaced, how do you reach all of the 2 point something million people that live in Gaza? Like it's a challenge to reach people in a highly organized state like Sweden
on an ordinary week.
Yeah. On an ordinary week, I mean, imagine trying to reach people when the address is just like in a tent in the desert. I mean, it sounds
maybe in the south,
exactly.
Maybe in the north, we don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Incredibly difficult.
So yeah, deplorable this specific iteration of this genocide for sure.
Yeah.
On that horrific note, thank you, Sam, for joining me this morning, and talk to you next week.
Yes. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.